So this week on the Eldorado, we're working with the intake manifold. I've cut a bunch of the parts and pieces off of it that were in the way. For instance, I got rid of the EGR parts off the back of the intake manifold, and I also got rid of the exhaust recirculation port cast into the underside of it. And that takes away some of the weight, but it also just cleans things up, makes it a little easier for us to work with the manifold. And then I ported the inside of it by cutting out the webbing on the inside underneath the carburetor. So we're going to jump right into some time lapses on working with the intake manifold, and then after the cleanup we'll get into the next exciting thing that happened this week, which is our fresh new engine. And there's some exciting developments on that, so go ahead and let's dive into the time lapses, and then we'll check in with the motor after that. So now that we've spent some time cutting and grinding and welding on this intake manifold, we see what we got here. So right off the back side of the intake manifold, here's where we did most of the work. There used to be an EGR port on the back of the manifold like in this area. And we went ahead and we cut all that BS out of there. And then I used steel to weld it back in. Now cast iron is not exactly easy to weld, but if you're careful, you can do a pretty decent job of it. And since I didn't actually disturb any of the intake ports, I'm fine with welding this because this just goes into the intake valley above the lifters and so on and so forth. So there's no pressure on this part of it, this part of the intake. So I'm happy to weld in pieces there. Now on the inside, you can see where we cut all the webbing out here. This is where I'm going to have to do some extra work. A little later, I got to get some different tools to be able to reach down inside there and port the rest of that intake manifold correctly. And then you can see down in here these little nubs of weld that have to be ground down where there were through holes into the bottom of the exhaust gas recirculation port. So underneath, lots of changes. So we cut out all that crap in here, and we cut out all the parts and pieces in here, and then I plated this section here and this section here where the old exhaust manifold valley section used to be, and then all this stuff around got cleaned off. And if you start to look at it from a distance, you can tell just how much we've taken away from this. So this is going to be pretty sweet having this all cleaned up. And like I said, it doesn't save a whole lot of weight, but it does save a little bit of weight. And it makes it a lot cleaner and nicer. And eventually when we port the top, It's going to make for a really nice intake manifold for this vehicle, and it'll be a lot cleaner than what it was factory and a whole lot less expensive than going out and buying a brand new intake. So in other developments, coming over here to the car, as we talked about last week, here is the new wiper switch, or new old. So this is how it was working from the factory. You got your high up top and then low on the bottom, and your wipe and wash button. So that's pretty cool to have found that piece. Very excited about that. And then in the back, we have a very white back seat cushion. And this is the correct one for the vehicle. Again, I sourced it out of a Buick Riviera, and I'll have to go ahead and recover it to match the rest of our black interior. But now we have our back seat. The most exciting thing this week by far is the engine. So my dad went up all the way to Washington to pick up this motor last week, and it's a heck of a lot nicer than our frozen 500. And in fact, this motor is even more than we realized. So right off, when I first got it, I pulled my valve covers loose, and as you can see, very nice and clean. All the signs of an engine that's been properly rebuilt. There's no slime or crud in any of the corners on the valves or anything like that. Looks super clean. Now, it did have a front sump pan on it, which is for a car or a late model 500, not an Eldorado. So initially when I got this motor, my first thought, based off of the casting numbers, was that it might be a early 472, not a 500. But I measured the stroke by putting a rod down number 2 and number 8 when number 2 is at top and number 8 is at bottom. Now that gave me stroke, so our total stroke top to bottom. Which was weird because I know enough about these Cadillac motors to know that the stroke from stock should be no more than 4.34 for a 500. I found 4.6. Now that's very strange. 4.6 would indicate that this motor is stroked. Not a 472, not a 500, but bigger. Then I did a little bit of research and discovered that our heads are later heads. They're not the high compression 76cc heads, they're the lower compression 120cc heads. Now, why would you have the lower compression heads and a big stroke? Well, I pulled the pan off to have a good look at that. And as you can see, somebody has been playing around in here big time. And if you look up here, right on the bottom side of that rod, you can see the block has been ground for clearance. And if you look at the rods themselves, they have been ground for clearance also. And a measurement across the rod bolts here and here tells me that these are not Cadillac rods. So, here's the crazy thing. This engine, given my measurements and the information I was able to determine from pulling the pan, is actually stroked to approximately 4.6 and overboard 60 thousandths, which makes this engine 550 cubic inches, approximately. Now we understand why it has the 120cc heads. With the 550 cubic inch displacement, if you put the 76cc heads on this engine and a flat top piston, you'd be somewhere in the neighborhood of 13-to-1 compression, which would be way too much for you to ever be able to run this motor on the street. Now, by using a flat top piston with a small dish, which is what this motor has in it, and the crazy aggressive stroke, you end up with a 550 cubic inch engine that will run on pump gas, which is apparently what we have here. So this is a hell of a find for a Cadillac motor, probably about the best I could have possibly done. And the machine work alone on this thing, just the machine work of the crank, would have probably been more than what we paid for this motor. So super excited about that. And one more thing that's a really good sign, you can tell that they've done the stroker, is if you look at the back of the crank here, you see that pin exuding from the back of the crank right there? So the crank has been reinforced because of the offset grind. So what they do to make this thing stroked is they offset grind the rod journal to one side and run a rod that's got a smaller diameter bearing, which allows you to go that maximum stroke. And yeah, it's got the clearances for it. So there we are. Our Eldorado has just gone from a simple restoration to a wild hot rod. And I cannot wait to see this motor fire up. It is going to just be completely crazy. 550 cubic inch monster Cadillac big block on pump gas. Nothing like it. So pretty excited this week. I was not expecting to find a stroked crank in the bottom of this new motor. I've read about the process of making these 500s into stroker motors. It's quite involved. You have to offset grind the crank. You have to do a lot of machine work. I believe they probably used like a big block Chevy rod. It's got over-the-counter Cadillac flat top pistons with a small dish in them. And that would be a standard piston. It's like a 60 over. And I looked up the calculation on it. If it's got 60 over pistons in it and an approximate 4.6 stroke, then it is indeed a 550. It's like 549.43 or something like that. So yeah, that's pretty crazy. It's about as much as you can possibly get away with one of these Cadillac big blocks. So yeah, that's going to be pretty exciting for a motor for this thing, which means I'm going to have to do a seriously good job rebuilding the automatic transmission I've got for this. Those overdrive 325 4L transmissions like what I've got came in a vehicle that had maybe 200 horsepower, if we're lucky. This 550 cubic inch big block is probably going to be right around 400 horsepower and maybe 600 foot-pounds of torque. So I got to do a really good job of building this automatic transmission for it to survive at all in front of this thing, or behind this thing. I think we've got some good things going in our favor. First of all, it's a front-wheel drive vehicle, so there's not as much distance between the engine and transmission and drivetrain and everything, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to break parts. Secondly, it's just an open differential, so there's no limited slip or locker or anything like that in there. So even if we do start to put a lot of power to the tires, it's probably just going to do a one tire fire kind of deal versus blowing up parts. All that being said, though, I'm going to have to be careful with it, and I'm going to have to build a really nice transmission to be able to handle it. So that's pretty crazy. And I'm really glad I took the time to take that old intake manifold, cut it up, and port it and repair it and do these modifications to it, because that motor is going to need all the airflow and fuel mixture it can possibly get. because it's going to be breathing fire out the tailpipe essentially. Anyway, pretty exciting week. We've got ourselves a crazy monster motor now for our wonderful Eldorado here, our good friend King. And yeah, we're real excited about that. Next week, I think we're going to go ahead and dive into the marker light holes on the sides of the fenders, get those filled and cleaned up. And we're just going to keep on trucking along and hopefully soon getting to the point where we can start rebuilding that transmission, because I want to get the old pile of junk out of this thing and drop this 550 cubic inch beast in and see what we can do. So until next week, hope you have a good one, and we'll see you then.